Liz Truss, I think in August 2022, when she was asked during a TV show. She was a candidate for the position of prime minister.
Yeah.
The journalist asked her if she was ready to use nuclear weapons and things like that. She said, yes, absolutely. And when the journalist asked her, even if it leads to global annihilation, and she said, yes, absolutely. At the end of the day, what these are officials. They are not a small official somewhere in
Right.
some ministries. These are the top leaders who have the upper hand on the security policy, on defense policy, on foreign policy, and all that. So when you have those people starting to use those words, of course, the Russians, because what we have seen, and remember, I mean, that was in France, again, the Minister of Economy, in the very first days of the Russian special military operation, he said, our aim is to make Russia to collapse. He said, the Russian people will suffer from it, but it's no importance for that. We want Russia to collapse.
Yeah, and with that, I mean, who is going to be passive in the face of that? And I want to continue on here. So that was Putin talking about the nuclear weapons, and then using the logical conclusion of where he's going to go. In case anybody's not clear what that is, I think he was almost very verbatim clear on the 29th of April when he was talking to Gerasimov on a video that they released publicly, when he was congratulating them on recapturing all of their territory. And then in terms of what the objective of the next phase are, he said this.
Авантюра киевского режима полностью провалилась. А понесенные противником огромные потери, в том числе и среди наиболее боеспособных, подготовленных и оснащенных, в том числе и западными образцами техники силами ВСО, а это штурмовые подразделения, спецназ, безусловно, отразятся на всей линии боевого соприкосновения. Полный разгром противника в Курском приграничье создает условия для дальнейших успешных действий наших войск и на других важнейших участках фронта, приближает разгром неонацистского режима.
So he just says it flat out there. The Kursk just set the conditions for the defeat of the Kyiv regime. He didn't say anything about negotiated settlement. He didn't even imply anything to that effect. He said that the defeat of the regime is his objective. How do you interpret that?
Well, I think, remember that the Russians think along the Clausewitzian doctrine, meaning that war is the continuation of politics with different means. And I think, and it probably is not completely wrong in that by having military defeats, it will help to make the political leadership to collapse in Kyiv. That's, I think, what he means. And that's also something we have seen in the recent weeks. We have seen a lot of movement in Ukraine, especially purges and things like this, people arrested and things alike. Because, of course, when you are winning, you can allow yourself whatever, because if you're winning, then you're on the right path. When you are losing, and when we say losing, we're not just, it's not just a defeat on the, I mean, tactical defeats. It's also losing lives. And I've read recently that you had some Telegram channel who make some assessment based on satellite imagery, and they have identified, or let's say, numbered the number of fatalities, not casualties, fatalities in Europe, in the Ukrainian forces, and this amounts to almost 770,000 killed people. So it's a lot of people. I don't know if this figure is reliable. It's based on satellite imagery, based on the imagery of the cemeteries and things like this, because they plant all the flags and all that, meaning that it's probably easier to count them. I have no idea if this figure is accurate, if it's reliable, but everything we have said already in your show and other shows indicate that the Ukrainians have suffered much more casualties and fatalities than the Russians. I don't know what are the exact numbers, but these figures are obviously much higher with the Ukrainians. And all that, even if we don't know it in our media, the Ukrainians know it. And that affects, of course, their understanding, or let's say their acceptance of the Ukrainian leadership. And it's probably not a coincidence that we have already addressed this issue in your show a few months ago, but we see an increase of resistance operations in Ukraine. A lot of Ukrainians, not simply Russians in Ukraine, or Russians, Ukrainians, if you want, but Ukrainians who tend to resist to forced recruitment and all that, and who perform, we can say, partisan activities, some you may probably call even terrorist activities, depending the vocabulary you use. Nevertheless, there is an active resistance.
And you're saying you're seeing an increase in that?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. You have a lot of attacks on railways, for instance, all those who provide for the transport of ammunition and troops and all that. I mean, the railways are, as it was it's a very similar situation as we had in 1944 in France, when the OSS and SOE tried to prevent the Germans to move towards Normandy and to disrupt railway transports. Same thing. Yeah. We have exactly the same thing. And that affects not just the areas close to the, or let's say, the areas where people are Russian speaking, such as Odessa or Nikolaev or Dnipropetrovsk, especially Nikolaev and Odessa, but also in areas which are completely in the west of the country, like Rovno and Lvov and all that, which are at the far western part of meaning very far away from those, I would say, traditional Russian areas, if you want. And these are Ukrainians' movement. These are not Russian movement. They cooperate with Russian movement, but they are Ukrainian in essence. And their purpose is essentially to fight against forced recruitment.
So it's not necessarily they're being pro-Russian. They just want the war to be over, and they want to stop the sacrifice of their people. Is that accurate?
It's exactly that. Because and that's why the number, all those small defeats, the local and tactical defeat, Pokrovsk and the Toretsk and all that, where you have those people dying for nothing, and Kursk is a case in point. That creates the situation of instability in Ukraine, because people realize that they fight for nothing, and they tried operations with no objectives, no real objectives, with no hope of success, and that's something that is very detrimental to the Ukrainian regime.
And I want to go down a related path here. You mentioned that this satellite imagery on the Ukraine side showed somewhere around 700,000 deaths, and who knows if that number is right or not. But there's also, and I want to say it was either I saw it this morning or maybe it was yesterday afternoon, I can't recall, that there was some similar kind of analysis done on the Russian side, and said that there would have been somewhere, I may be getting the number off, somewhere around 150,000 killed in action and a considerable number of wounded, and that the year 2024 saw more Russian deaths than any other year, with kind of the implication that maybe the Russian resolve is weakening. And I think maybe to answer that, Vladimir Putin, about say on the 30th of April, so just a little less than a week ago, was addressing some children actually in Russia, and kind of telling this generation why it's so important for them to sacrifice. And I think that he's, again, if you're paying attention, I think he's telling you how the Russians see themselves and this struggle.
When I said that this is a holiday for practically every one of our families, it is only natural because with such enormous losses, 27 million people for the entire Soviet Union, the exact number still not fully counted, it is clear that nearly every family was affected. And it is extremely important to use modern opportunities to convey this information, this truth about the past, in this case, about the Great Patriotic War and its heroes, to pass it on to both today and tomorrow. Only by understanding the price at which our today and our tomorrow were secured, only by grasping the cost and the deeds of our ancestors, our fathers, grandfathers, even great-grandfathers, grandmothers, in defending the motherland, only by realizing the sacrifice it entailed, can we comprehend who we are, where we came from, and what our country truly is.
So he's really driving home this thing that our previous generations and nearly every family in Russia today can trace some lineage of somebody who sacrificed something when 27 million of your countrymen died, and to say that that wasn't in vain, and that same thing is who we are, present tense, and wants to pass it down to the next generation. Do you see any chance that that's just hyperbole, or that the Russian character really is one that will suffer a great deal in something that they think is existential to their country?
Well, first of all, we have to understand that the Russians have definitely suffered the most heavy casualties during World War II. And the memory of all this sacrifice is cultivated in Russia. I remember when I was in the early 90s, I went to Moscow for not negotiation, but discussions with the high command of the Russian forces, and I had some spare time, and I went to the National Museum, the History Museum, and I was surprised to see a lot of kids, I mean, obviously school kids, that were visiting the museum. And with each group of small kids, you had a war veteran with all the medals and all that, and he was explaining the war that he experienced to the young children, and that was standard in Russia. But probably today those veterans are probably all dying, and they don't do that. But what they have done, and if you see at the different military parades, for instance, Vladimir Putin started to do that probably something like 15 years ago, 20 years ago. He started to have the invisible regiment. And when you have the military parade, the one we see with the tanks and all that, you also have a parade of all civilians wearing or having a photograph of their relative who died in World War II. So they are definitely cultivating this spirit of sacrifice. They recognize the sacrifice of the former generation, and war has been somehow a link between generations. And that was very clear to me when I saw these kids in the National History Museum. But beyond that, we also have to understand that the Russians are extremely emotionally related to their motherland. It's extremely strong And it's not only just the Russians, by the way, but the Belarusians are also like this. And I had a couple of friends who married, for instance, a Belarusian woman, and he said it's sometimes very difficult because they are so related to Belarusia, to their family, to their country, that they become homesick as soon as they start living out of the country. And there are figures that are not well known, but because during the Cold War, it was not something that we wanted to explain. But I remember, and I may be wrong on the figure, but that's an idea that gave an idea. During the Cold War, 60% of those Soviets who emigrated to the US returned to the Soviet Union, not to Russia, to Soviet Union during the war, the Cold War, because they were not used to our way of living. We are used to that. You are used in the way you live in your country and me in my country, and that's normal. But for them, it was so different because the communist system had a lot of disadvantages, and because of the disadvantages, it created a solidarity among people. In fact, the people was very much together to fight the system, so to say. And you had this kind of solidarity among individuals that you didn't really find in the Western countries. And this makes the social or the societal fabrics in Russia extremely strong. And I'll explain why. For instance, the Russians have a lot of, let's say, compassion for those Russians who were left behind when the Soviet Union was disbanded, and with all those Russians who were left in those new independent countries, such as in the Baltic states, such as in Ukraine, Georgia, all these countries who became independent, and you had a lot of Russians, ethnic Russians, who were there, and they were just trapped by the situation, if you want, and they stayed in the countries where they were living because they lived there since generations. But at the same time, these countries, and that's very true for the Baltic states, and just take the example of Estonia, for instance, which just 2 weeks ago adopted a law that prevents Russians to vote in local elections.
Yeah, that doesn't portend a lot of good things for the future, because that's some of the things that Ukraine went down the path before the 2014.
Exactly, this is exactly that.
Yeah,
and remember that in Ukraine, on the 1st of July 2021, the Ukrainian parliament in Kyiv adopted a law that gives different rights to the citizens based on their ethnicity. And that's the law on the indigenous people that, in fact, consider the Russians as non-indigenous, and therefore they were not granted all the same rights as other Ukrainian citizens. You know, we have exactly the same, and we had exactly the same thing in Georgia. And that for that reason, the Russians are ready to wage war, because at the end of the day, it's a matter of some kind of, it's existential, not for those who live in Russia, but it's existential for those Russians who live outside Russia. So the word existential that the Russians have used many times to explain why they were fighting, a lot of people understood that as existential for Russia. It's not existential for Russia as a country, but it's existential for Russia as a nation.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that's completely lost on us. We just don't. I mean, that's kind of a nuance. It's a big nuance, though, one which I think it just goes right over the head of most of us.
Absolutely.
And continuing down the path here of thinking that of not getting information like that and understanding, as you used earlier in this show, is that the thought that, well, if we just bring enough political or economic pressure on Russia, they'll concede and they'll give in to some of the things that we want. And here, of course, lately, Donald Trump has been trying to negotiate some kind of an end to the war. And over the weekend here, he says, one of the big problems I'm having is there's just a lot of hatred going on.
We've had some good conversations on Russia and Ukraine over the weekend, over the last few days actually, but we've had some very good conversations on Russia and Ukraine. There's a lot of hatred there, I will tell you, between the two parties and between even the generals. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of hatred, but we've had some very good discussions over the last few days.
So I'm not really sure how good the discussions have been based on things we've seen lately here. But I wonder if you could just kind of address the significance of that statement, because I mean, it's not at all surprising that there's a lot of hatred between the two sides. If you're at war with each other and you're killing each other, you're not going to have any good feelings for them. But I mean, really, you can say that about any war where the two sides are trying to have a negotiated settlement. But how do you see it playing out in this between the Ukraine and the Russian side?
Well, the thing is that, if you look at it from the Russian side, and coming back to the previous discussion we just had, a lot of sanctions that have been applied to Russia, in fact, applies to Russians, not just to Russia. You and me probably experienced the Cold War. But during the Cold War, we were fighting a system. We're fighting not the Russians, not individuals. We are fighting the communist system.
Yep.
And that's what we wanted to prevent our country to become communist. Right or wrong, this idea that the Soviets wanted to impose communism to our country, I'm not discussing that, although the CIA has eventually assessed that, in fact, the Soviets never wanted to attack Europe. But that's beyond the point. But we used to fight a system, not individuals. Today, we are fighting individuals. For instance, when you go in France, a lot of people who have a name that sounds like Russian. I'm not saying they are Russians. They have a family name that sounds Russian. The bank closed their account just because the name was similar to a Russian name. And that, I mentioned that in my book, that's just something absolutely incredible. Now I think these things have a little bit calmed down a little bit, but we are fighting people, and for that reason, the Russians feel that the war they are waging is also a matter of national pride. I'm not sure that they had this hatred against Ukrainians as such. And I think it would be an oversimplification to summarize the problem as hatred. Obviously, after you have fought so harshly in 3 years, you have a lot of hatred that is coming. I mean, at the end of the day, we have probably in some areas something that we have probably seen in Bakhmut and things. It becomes like in civil wars. Civil wars are always terrible. People become more emotional than in normal wars. That's a very known fact. During World War I, for instance, my grandfather was French and he used to fight in World War I, but they had no animosity against the Germans, if you want. It was not, there was nothing personal. They were told to fight, they were disciplined, and they fought. But it was nothing personal against people. And we had, on many occasions during World War I, as in World War II, by the way, we had this case of, I don't know if the word is correct in English, fraternalization. When the two parts start to, on Christmas, for instance, right, or some occasion, and Easter and things like that, when the two parties in a village or so, you have people fighting each other, and they decide some kind of ceasefire. They very locally, at a very, very local level, and that happened several times on the French front in World War One. But you don't have that in a situation where the war starts to evolve in some kind of civil war, and that's probably what we are witnessing in Ukraine. But in Ukraine, you have an additional aspect that you didn't have in previous war, is that the use of paramilitaries, who are basically fanatical or fanaticized people. And these people are, let's say, ideologically motivated. They are not just soldiers, disciplined soldiers that can, because the purpose of armies, the conventional armies, as you know and as I know, the purpose of an army is to have control over the use of force, so that force doesn't become violence, if you want. That's why we have discipline in armies. When you stop fire, you stop fire. When you are ordered to fire, to stop, you stop. When you have people who are fanatical, then that doesn't apply. People continue to fight up to the last. Yeah. And this is why armies are very important, because it's not just the formal discipline that you have on the in the barracks and things like this. It's also the discipline to be able to use force as needed, not too much, not too less. I mean, as required. And what you see, for instance, when you have people starting to shoot at kids, for instance, in Palestine, then we are beyond that. It's not the purpose of armies to do that. An army is precisely there to have the use of, I prefer to use the word use of force rather than the use of violence, because force is when you have a control over the use of all the weapons you have. When it starts to be violence, then you are in a gang type war where you don't have control over what you are doing.